Germany has been more green, arguably, than Canada, let's say, for the last 10 years. And they've shut off their nuclear plants and they've made a transition to renewables. And so what's the consequence of that? Well, one consequence is that German energy prices are now 5 times as expensive as they are in the US. And then you might say, well, that's a small price to pay for saving the planet. But then we could take that apart. So Germany is rapidly deindustrializing and their economy is tanking, and all the industrial production that they no longer manage is only shifting to other places in the world like China and India. So it's not like it's going away. It's just not happening in Germany. And they're increasingly dependent on renewables, solar and wind. And Germany is one of the world's sunniest countries, and it's also susceptible to what they call wind drought. So there are long periods of time where the solar arrays and the windmills aren't producing any electricity. And like zero electricity is not very much electricity. Now, why is that a catastrophe? It's like, well, do you want your refrigerator on or off? Or even more to the point, do you want to be able to go to the hospital and make sure that there's electricity when you're having emergency surgery, etc.? You know, and there are signs, for example, that places like Australia that have been moving down the renewable pathway are facing the imminent threat of rolling blackouts. And that could easily happen in places like Germany. Okay, so now the problem with renewables is that we can't store the energy. We don't have the battery technology and the battery infrastructure, not even close. And it's going to be a long time before we do, at least 20 years, maybe longer than that. And so the question is now, what do you have to do? Because renewable energy is so unreliable. Sometimes like at night, the sun doesn't shine, in case you hadn't noticed, and the wind stops blowing. And so then renewable production falls to zero. Now, you have to have something to back that up. And worse, you have to have something of the same size as the entire renewable grid, because otherwise it can't handle the power demands. And so that means that as you switch to a renewable grid, you have to have another grid in place that has exactly the same capacities, and it has to be not renewable. So what that means is that when you build a renewable grid, you build it in addition to the pre-existing grid. And then you might say, well, if the renewable sources aren't producing energy, you could just turn to nuclear, but there's a couple of problems with that. First of all, you can't turn a nuclear power plant on and off quickly, as you might well imagine. And the Germans, for example, scuttled their nuclear plants. And so what have they done? They've turned to coal-burning plants. And the Germans don't burn anthracite, which is high-quality coal that doesn't produce much particulate matter, which is like the dust pollution that would be associated with smog. And they burn lignite, which is low-quality coal, and it produces a lot of particulate, plus it produces a lot of carbon dioxide. And so what's happened in Germany after 10 years of green idiocy is that their power prices are 5 times as expensive. They're hyper-reliant on places like Russia and the Middle East for their fossil fuel production, not least because Canada was too daft to enter into an agreement with them. And they pollute more per unit of energy produced than they did 10 years ago. So even if you accept the environmentalist argument that carbon dioxide overproduction is an existential crisis, which it isn't, and you say, well, something substantial needs to be done to ameliorate the threat, you have to observe that when something substantial has been done, so that's the creation, let's say, of a renewable power grid, the consequence is not only that the atmosphere doesn't improve with regards to carbon dioxide proportion, but that the pollution problem actually gets much worse, as well as energy becoming more expensive and unreliable. And so what? That's what you want Carney to do for Canada. And for Canada, there's not a country in the world that's more dependent fundamentally for its existence on reliable energy, because Canada is uninhabitable without an unbelievably well-developed industrial and energy infrastructure, just to keep us alive when it's 40 bloody below. And then our economy is radically dependent on our natural resource production. Now, it shouldn't be that dependent on natural resource production, because we should be doing value-added investment, for example, refining our fossil fuel resources to a higher degree than we currently do. Most of that's done in the United States, and we should do things to ensure that we make the proper transition into a technologically driven future. But Carney says absolutely nothing about any of that in his book Values. And so he just magically hand-waves and says, oh, well, if you unleash the private sector, there'll be this magical net zero transformation, and everyone will have much more productive jobs, and the planet will be much greener, and we won't need to rely on fossil fuels. Well, we don't just rely on fossil fuels for energy, folks. We rely on fossil fuels to make damn near everything that we make, including our agricultural products. And so you also hear the net zero people claiming that agricultural production has to be slashed radically. And so you can imagine what that's going to do to food costs if you haven't noticed. And part of the reason for that is that the fertilizers that we use, ammonia, for example, are created out of fossil fuels. And so you have no idea how much the entire economy, and so that's your bread and butter and your house and your heating and your air conditioning and your travel and your vacations and your kids' future, that's all dependent on the fossil fuel economy. And so Carney, there's two tacks you can take to Carney. One is either he's learned that his net zero preoccupation was wrong, which means every single thing he thought while he was being educated and while he had his highfalutin career, every single thing he thought was radically not only wrong, but the opposite of the truth. That's one conclusion. Or he still thinks what he's always thought, which is certainly what it seems to be in his book Values, and certainly seems to be the case with his continuing insistence that we have to hit net zero by 2050 and spend $2 trillion doing it. The alternative conclusion to he was just radically wrong and has learned is that he hasn't learned a damn thing. And it's still his fundamental axiomatic presupposition that human being industrial production leading to carbon dioxide overproduction is an existential threat that should be everyone's top priority for every financial decision that they make, and that everything should be secondary to that. And that implies that his claim to eliminate the carbon tax, for example, and to move Canada onto a more solid industrial footing in the future is just a lie. So those are your options. Either he was completely wrong about everything for the last 20 years in the worst direction possible and has learned, or that he hasn't learned a damn thing and is still sticking to exactly what he wrote in his book Values in 2021 and exactly what he's indicated in all of his public pronouncements. And he's going to act as if he's in favor of Canadian economic development, but he's going to keep pursuing a net zero agenda because that's priority number one.